Who doesn't love a good template? Am I right? So in today's video, I'm going to give you my master episode guide that I use to put all the information for all of my episodes. I'm going to give you that, and I'm going to go over that with you, as well as an actual script template that I use for my podcast. Now, a quick disclaimer off the top. There's no one way to do this kind of stuff. I just thought it would be easier if I gave you the guides that have worked for me for 15 years in creating podcasts. Okay, you ready? We're gonna dive into this. The first document I want you to take a look at is the master episode guide. Now, when you look at it in this form, it's pretty simple. And until you've done several episodes, it's kind of hard to see the benefit of this. But I want to go through this and show you how I set this up. You can take these guides, you can make them your own, but it's always helpful to start with something in the beginning, right? So let's take a look at this document. The first thing that I have in the column is the episode number. Here's a quick tip. When creating your episode numbers, you usually want to go out a few spaces. So don't just call it episode 1, call it 001. 002, 003. This is an old television way of numbering things, but it works really well because we're assuming you at least get to 100 episodes, and this format doesn't start to become an issue until you break 1,000, and when you do that, call me because we're gonna have a huge party. The other thing that I do, you may notice over here in this document, this is for my podcast called Preggy Pals. So Preggy Pals, PP, that's what this stands for, PP001. Now, this can be really helpful if you're producing multiple podcasts. Come up with some sort of code name for that podcast, and I simply grabbed the first letter of each word. That is the code name for each of the podcasts I create. And then I add 001, 002, 003 after that. That becomes the episode number in its entirety. So when I'm recording something, that's how I will label it. When I come up with the master file that I'm going to upload to the podcast host provider, that's what I call that. And it's documented in this guide as well. I view this guide, this is my go-to source whenever I want to look back and know what episodes I have discussed in the past, which experts I've had on my show, what other guests were on the show, what segments were part of the show. That's all of this condensed into one. But I always start with the episode number. Then I have my episode title. I just literally write out word for word whatever the episode title is. And this has helped me to make sure that no two episode titles are too similar. We always want to go back and really think about those keywords because, again, episode titles are searchable, SEO friendly, and so we want to make sure that people can find our podcast in multiple ways. So I like to go back and see what I've already done as a podcast title and be able to do something a little bit different if I have a similar topic in the future. So that's the episode title. Next is the recording date. So when did I actually record this episode? And this can be helpful if you're looking at things like your files on your computer. It usually says what date it was recorded. And so if you do bulk recording in the future, we're going to talk about that when we get into the recording process. You may have a bunch of files on your desktop, and if you weren't really organized in the beginning, you may not know which is which. So I like to include the recording date here. Then the release date, which is usually different than the recording date. You're going to record on one day, release a different day, especially if you're doing that bulk recording. So this would be the date that this episode is released. This is the expert, and the way that I did mine is I wrote the expert's name, comma, and then what their business is. You could do whatever you wanted to. It's just important to know who the expert was in this episode. And I use this a lot. If I have an expert that's really eager to be on the show, so they come on the show, they love it, they have a great time, our audience really enjoys them, I do want to invite them back, but I don't necessarily want them to come back super quick. I may want to space things out. And so this has a great way of, at a glance, me being able to see when was the last time they were on one of my episodes, and then I can make a decision from there when they're going to come back. So that's your expert. whoever the host is. This can be great if you have multiple hosts that are part of your show. If you have the same host over and over again, or if you're the host and you're always going to put your name in here, then maybe it's not as important. It can also be helpful though if you have a podcast where you have one host and then it could change in the future. So maybe there's only one host at a time, but in the case of my podcast here, Preggy Pals, we've had like 3 or 4 hosts. They weren't all the host at the same time. We started out, in fact, when we launched the show, I was the host. And then it got to a point where I was no longer having babies, becoming pregnant. And so I wanted a host that was still kind of going through that whole process. So I invited someone else to guest, to host the show. And then that happened 3 or 4 times. So even though you think you may not need a space for host, you might need it down the road. All right, next up we have our producer slot, and really you can put whatever, whatever team members you have working on the show. You could create a column for each of those team members. So if you have multiple editors you work with, if you have different producers, if you have different assistants, that whole list of team members, that whole video we did on team members, if that differs per show, then you may want to have categories for each of those people. Yes, so in the case of this show, I had an expert, but then I also invited pregnant women on the show to talk about the topic as well from their perspective. That was kind of the whole idea of that podcast. Next, we have our segments. So I have 2 segments listed here. If you only have 1 segment in your show, you would only have 1 column, but you literally write the name of the segment in there. And again, that helps you down the road when you're planning segments. When was the last time I did that segment? When was the last time we did a mailbag segment, or brought one of our fans on or one of our listeners on to participate in the show? Having a document like this really does help. And you can actually take this a step further if you want. So not only could you list the name of the segment here, but you could create other tabs at the bottom. And I've done this with some of my shows, and the tabs are called the name of the segment. And then when you open up that tab, it lists all the different topics that you've had in that segment. And then you can say what episode that was part of. That was part of PP001. So you can see how elaborate this can get if you want it to, but it can also be very simple as well. All right, video. If you are also recording video in addition to the audio for your podcast, that's becoming a popular thing. You can have a section for that to say, yes, video was recorded with this as well. If you have a transcript for your show, we're going to talk about some of this stuff a little bit later on in later videos, but whatever components are really important to your show, create a column for it. Your episode link. Now in this, I link to the podcast website, and on the website, each episode had its own page. That can be really good for search engine optimization, right? To be able to pick up some of those keywords and send them directly to an episode where all those terms are important. And that's what I listed here. And then we have our mid-roll spots. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about podcast advertising in the profit section. I think that's the 5th P of P's of podcasting. But mid-roll spots are spots that occur in the middle of your show. So it's not before your show starts, that's a pre-roll. It's not after your show, that's a post-roll. It's in the middle, and it doesn't have to literally be in the middle of your show. But if it takes place during your content part of your show, again, not the beginning, not the end, in the middle somewhere, those are called mid-rolls. And what I've listed here is the time code for when my 2 breaks, remember in formatting we talked about breaks. Well, this is a 30-minute podcast, and we know that we can have a break every 15 minutes of content. So I have 2 in a 30-minute show. I went through and marked the time codes there so I knew where those breaks were in my show. The second thing that I want to show you guys is a sample podcast script. And this is really important. Now, I keep saying this, but I can't say it enough. I'm not saying you have to do it exactly the way I did this, but it is helpful to have a model so you can see what's been done and what has worked in the past, so you can make some tweaks based on what's best for the format of your show. So I want to go through this script template. I encourage you to modify it, make it your own. I just want to show you what has worked for me in the past. So let's take a look here. This script is actually 2 pages long. That's okay. If you can make it 1 page, that's even better. It's kind of like people tell you keep your resume short. It's kind of the same idea, but this works. At the top here, this would be the recording date as well as the time. And here's a quick little tip. If you can list whether it's Pacific time, Eastern time, whatever time zone, do it. I cannot tell you how many times my communication with a guest has kind of been thwarted because I was talking Pacific time and they were talking Eastern time. So now it is just part of my vernacular to say Pacific time or Eastern time. And it's smart to include time zones when you're listing out your recording time. And then we have in blue here, we have the recording link. That's the link that your guests will go to in order to record with you on the day of recording. So I like to put that at the top. That way it's right there with the script. So the moment they open up the script, everything's right there. They don't have to look for a link in another email or something like that. It's all right there for them. All right, we've got the name or title of our episode, as well as, you see I snuck it in here, PP001, right? That's what I'm labeling this episode. That's what's gonna help keep my episode very organized. That's what's listed in the master episode guide as well. I put the expert's name and their title up here. And now we're ready to start the show. The first little paragraph that you're looking at here, and again, you can do this multiple ways. You could include a soundbite off the top of your show, or you could do what I'm calling a topic tease. So let me break those down for you. The soundbite is a great little 10 to 15 second snippet of your interview that you did with an expert. Okay, this is assuming that you've interviewed someone for your show. So an expert, a guest, somebody else besides you. If you've got that great little nugget of information, it can be killer in putting it at the very beginning of your podcast because you're drawing people into your show. You want them to stay for the entire episode. And so you gotta give them something good. You gotta give them that little hook, right? Hook them into your episode. So that's a great way to do it. The example that I have here is something that I did with my shows that worked out really well, and that is what I'm calling a topic tease. So we're telling people what our show is going to be about, but we're doing it in an interesting way. So you can see here, you can read this, but I'm kind of setting up the mood here. You spend 9 months preparing for the little miracle inside your body to finally arrive. It's an instant you want to cherish for generations to come. Professional birth photography helps you capture those precious first moments of life when your world changes forever. Our special guest today is Katie Stevens from Viewfinder Birth Photography. This is Preggy Pals. That was my standard intro. Either I read it or sometimes I would have the guest read it depending on how good I thought they were going to do. You do have to be careful with that because sometimes guests don't read scripts very well, so it's usually better for perhaps the host to say it. But what I love about this model is there's always something different in the beginning of your episode. Don't just start your episode with the same music because it's so redundant and monotonous. You want something different. So whether it's a different description of what's coming up in the episode or it's that great little nugget, that soundbite that you're able to grab from the interview, either one works really well. But keep it short, 10 to 15 seconds. And I always like to say at the end, this is Preggy Pals. Obviously, you can do that with a soundbite, but if you're doing a topic tease, tell them what the name of the show is. And then you can transition. You can just have some music. You can also have a more elaborate show intro, but keep that short. Keep it short, 10 to 15 seconds. And then you could come on, say hello to the audience. If you had any announcements that you want to mention to people, you can see here in the script, there are some promotional things that I wanted to say. I wanted to remind people that they could download our app. We had an app at one point for this show. They could subscribe to our newsletter. The things that I would put in here are things that are not time sensitive. I like to refer or to keep anything that's time sensitive. I like to put those in those little promo breaks. When you put a podcast episode out there, it's out there indefinitely. It's out there until you decide to take it down for whatever reason. And someone could be listening to this episode, which was the first episode we ever did for Preggy Pals, they could be listening to that 2 years after I originally created it. It's now been about 5 years since I created this show. And the episode is still available. People could be listening to that today. And if they hear old announcements, it's not the best overall experience for your listener. So I like to reserve anything that's time sensitive for those break spots, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. All right, so that is the announcements. Now, if you were going to do segments in your show, this is a great place for your first segment. So that's why I said it's an optional segment. Usually segments are shorter. They don't have to be, but in this example, this is a shorter segment. And you can see this was a question that one of our listeners submitted to us through Facebook. And so the format of that was they submitted it through Facebook, so our host read the question, and then we submitted the question to one of our experts, and then the expert would answer it, usually in some sort of voicemail system that we had set up. So I would just be, taking the question and then combining the answer with that, and that was the segment, and that took about, 2 to 5 minutes to do. Now, it's time for us to kind of transition into the next part of the show. And any kind of big transition point is a great spot for those breaks I was telling you about. So it could be a promo break, it could be a commercial break, some sort of break. That's a great spot for it. So that's why in here I have midroll, because this is a midroll spot. And the way that I actually do these spots is I save that for later. So I don't record anything directly into my episode. I do it later. We'll talk more about promos and commercial spots when we talk more about profiting and promoting your show. But for now, I just know in the recording process, I know that I'm gonna toss to some sort of break, and that's really what you need to know here. And you can see in here I say, we'll be right back after this quick break. So we come back out of the break, and honestly, when I'm recording this, I just kind of stop down for a second. I don't stop recording, but I just kind of check in with everyone. Hey, is everyone doing okay? How are we doing on time? We're doing good on time. Does that sound okay? Do I need to redo anything? I may ask for some feedback on stuff, but it gives me a breaking point. Then from there, we come back and we introduce the topic or the expert, really, because we kind of already did a topic tease at the top of the show. But we'll do an expert introduction. So you can see I welcome people back. Welcome back, everyone. I kind of reintroduce the topic a little bit, and I say, hey, Katie Stevens is here in the studio to join us. Remind them who she is. She's a professional birth photographer here in San Diego. Katie, welcome to Preggy Pals. That's a great way to kind of toss it to your guests, so your guests can say what they always say, thank you, it's great to be here. They say that like 9 times out of 10. So let them get their little moment there to say thank you for being on the show. And then, and this is just my advice, you can see some of this stuff has been scripted in the show. I mean, we're calling this a script. But usually when I get to an interview format, you really can't script that kind of stuff out. You really can't. So from here on out, I pretty much just have bullet points for my questions. And it's important that not too much of your episode is scripted, because it's really hard to read something and make it sound supernatural, like you were just asking it. But if you just had a bullet point, you could do that, right? So the interview portion of my script is always bullet points, and I write out my questions, and you can see I've kind of budgeted 10 minutes for the interview. This is keeping in mind about a 30 or so minute show. And then I break up the interview in 2 parts, because if you have an interview like that or a topic where that's the bulk of your episode, usually dividing that in half is a great breaking point, again, for a promo or for an ad spot, a commercial break. So that's what I've done here. I ask my first set of questions, then I say, hey, coming up next, this is what we're gonna talk about. We'll be right back. That goes into the second mid-roll break, and usually, again, I just stop down. Hey, is everyone doing okay? Are we doing on time? Did I miss anything? Should I ask anything else on the second part that we didn't get to in the first part? I'll do things like that, okay? We come out of the second mid-roll spot. Welcome back. Today we're talking with Katie Stevens about birth photography. I'm I'm reminding them who we're talking to and what the topic is about. During these commercial breaks, it is possible for your audience to press pause, and they may not come back to that episode for a day, 2 days, a week. So I like to remind people what we're talking about when we come out of a break. Then we have the second part of the interview. Then I wrap things up. You always thank your guests. Hopefully that will come naturally, but they are giving their time to be on your show, and it should be an honor for you to have them on your show. Always thank them, and then you kind of wrap up with the guests. And then what I would do is I would go into my second segment. And in this case, this was a segment about great pregnancy resources that are available for pregnant moms. And so in this script here, I just kind of led into it. I didn't write out the whole thing, but you would obviously go into more detail about that. But that was a segment that we had on the show. We wanted to tell people, listen, if you're looking for more pregnancy resources, are there great blogs you can be part of? Are there great YouTube channels that you should check out? So it's just, we're trying to provide more value to our listeners, and doing it through this segment. It was a popular segment, so it worked out really well. And then at the end, we say our goodbyes. I wouldn't draw it out forever. I gave it 30 seconds, but I just wrap up the show. And I always give the audience an opportunity to connect with us somehow. So you could tell them to contact you via email. You could promote your website if you have a separate website. At one point, we had a voicemail that people could leave messages on, so I promoted the voicemail in this. And then I always have some sort of tagline that I wrap up the whole show with. And my tagline for this show is, thanks for listening to Preggy Pals, your pregnancy, your way. Because that was the whole point of the show. We were giving them options of what they could do during their pregnancy or their childbirth experience. And so it made a lot of sense to say, this is your pregnancy, and you're gonna do it your way. We're gonna be with you on this journey. So I love taglines. If you can figure out a quick little tagline for your show, that is amazing. I do share scripts in advance. I think it helps with the flow of the conversation so they can see how the episode is going to unfold. I think that makes the conversation more rich and organic, and honestly just fun. If you are recording remotely, I highly recommend that you keep these on Google or somehow in some sort of cloud drive that you guys can both access, and it will make your experience just a lot more easier and enjoyable for both you and your guest.